if we want to stay below 1.5 degrees, then we have roughly 380 to 400 gigatons of CO2 left. So we have about 5 to 10 years from 2023 onwards.
This is Lisa Mangertseder. Lisa is a venture capital associate at Carbon Removal Partners, and today she is here to talk about the importance of carbon removal technologies in the fight against climate change. Over the past 2 years, Lisa has invested millions of dollars in startups accelerating innovation in the carbon removal industry, such as Climeworks, Heirloom, or Litos. In this episode, we'll dive into the world of carbon removal technologies, including direct air capture.
Some people refer to it as a vacuum cleaner.
Enhanced rock weathering.
The surface of the rock, when it reacts with water, it binds the CO2 and it creates a bicarbonate.
And some hot takes.
Most of the companies are not at a point where a bank would be happy to give them a grant.
Thank you to everyone listening to this episode, and don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to this channel. Before even talking about carbon removal, I think we need to set the stage for something that's very important. It might seem like a stupid question, but what is CO2 exactly, and why do we need to remove it?
CO2 is a chemical compound. It's one carbon atom and two oxygen atoms. And it's all around us all the time because it's naturally, it appears in a gas form, can also appear in a solid form, like dry ice, or in a liquid form. But as we know it, it's a gas, it's around us. And it moves between the atmosphere, the oceans, the soil, living organisms, trees, and us. And so basically it regulates the Earth's climate. So there's a natural carbon cycling happening all the time. So as we would say, there are 422 parts per million CO2 molecules in the air as of now. And you might think, oh, that's not a lot, right? But actually, those 422 parts per million are way more than we had in pre-industrial levels. So, for example, in 1990, we had about 354 parts per million in the atmosphere. And so that's roughly where we want to get back to. So even though it sounds little, it's still too much, and we need to do something about it.
Of course. And so let me go back to what you said. So CO2 is already there. It's part of a normal process that exists on the planet. So why is it that everybody thinks of CO2 as this, mystical bad thing that's going to kill all of us? Like, what's happening on the planet? Why are we producing more than before?
The main reason why the concentration is rising is because we are using up fossil fuels, and we're using it to, for example, produce plastics and cement and steel, and for driving our vehicles and planes, etc., etc. And we're using so much of it that produces so much CO2 that the concentration is constantly rising. And so, as I mentioned it at the beginning, the Earth is naturally breathing, so to say. So we have a carbon cycle, and the air, like for example, the ocean and the forests that we have on the planet Earth, they are absorbing CO2 as they grow, and they normally do that. But there's more and more CO2 coming, or more CO2 being released every year than the air can absorb again. So basically, we're increasing our concentration gradually, and that is causing global warming. I have to add, though, there are other greenhouse gases. For example, there's methane, and methane is in itself even more dangerous than you could say than CO2, but it lasts much less longer in the atmosphere than CO2.
Right. So there is not only one gas that we should care about, but obviously CO2 is the one that's the most famous. One thing that came along with this increase in CO2 is the carbon market. I'm curious if you can, give me a bit of context as to how this market came to life and how it led to carbon removal technologies being developed.
I would say the beginning, or like the start of it, was in 1997 with the Kyoto Protocol. That was when 192 parties under the United Nations framework Convention on Climate Change, the UNFCCC. That's something that sometimes come around. And so basically they got together and they said, okay, we need to do something to reduce greenhouse gases, the gases that we just talked about. And they said, okay, we want to reduce it to below the 1990 targets or 5% below that. And then they thought about, okay, how are we going to do that? And they said, okay, we need to introduce emissions trading. We need to do something about these emissions. And they developed the Clean Development Mechanism, the CDM. And so basically, the industrialized nations, those that are mainly responsible for the CO2 or like use of fossil fuels, they set up the CDM and they thought about, okay, how can we invest in projects to reduce emissions? And so this whole trading started, but it didn't really work because back then the projects were and you probably have heard of them, but they basically were, let's say, if you don't cut down this forest, then I will pay you for it. And there was a lot of fraud, and there was a lot of questionable, issues around additionality. So basically, would you really have cut down this forest, or was this never planned? So basically, it didn't really work. So the whole CDM never really ended up working. There were a lot of issues around additionality, as I just said. They were super complex to set them up, to do the registration of these credits and the transactions. There was a lot of regional imbalances. So most of these credits went to China, India, Brazil, but the least developed countries didn't really benefit from it. There was an oversupply. Prices didn't pick up. So basically, you didn't really have any positive impact. And then in 2015, the Paris Agreement was established. And again, they said, okay, we need to do this better. And they established the notion of net zero and the idea of a global carbon budget. So they said, okay, we have this remaining carbon budget that we need to get to net zero by 2050. And we want to stay below 2 degree, ideally hit 1.5 degree above pre-industrial levels. And with the Paris Agreement came nationally determined contributions, NDCs. And so every country kind of like committed to getting to net zero by 2050, some even earlier than that. And with that came the voluntary carbon market. And the credits that we just talked about that are traded under Article 6.4 and 6.2, they are traded on the voluntary carbon market.
Got it. So if we go back to the definition of a credit, because that might not seem as easy for everyone to understand. A credit in the carbon credit industry is to say, if you reduce CO2 emission, I'll give you money. Is that the way I should understand it?
You can either have credits for reducing emissions or removing emissions. And the critical difference here is that reducing is basically from 1 to -1, so you're at 0. That is reducing. And then removing, you would go to -1. So you remove an emission that was already there before.
Can you tell me more about the measurement? Because, I cannot catch CO2 in the atmosphere and say, hey, like, here's a small bucket of CO2, like, I give it to you, right? Like, how does it work? Like, how do you measure carbon removal or even carbon reduction in that case?
Actually, there's a term for it. It's called Measuring, Reporting, Verification, MRV. And it's such a critical part of the carbon removal industry, because if you cannot measure how much you have removed, then you cannot issue one certificate that guarantees, hey, this is how much I have removed. And this is different from method to method, because your question was how to do that. It really depends from method to method.
For sure. So let's talk about the carbon removal technologies and that we have available, and then we talk about the measurement as well. So, what is the landscape? I feel like there are 4 or 5 technologies that exist and buckets that I've seen doing my research, but maybe you can tell me more.
There are a couple of known carbon removal methods, and basically you can dissect this value chain into the first part is how do you remove it, and then the second part, how do you store it? Because those two belong together, because if you don't store it, then it gets released again, then the whole removal was for nothing. So for the removal part, you can see it as a spectrum from very nature-based methods to very technological methods. And on the very nature-based side, you have afforestation, reforestation. So basically, you grow forests where they haven't been before, or you improve forest management so that there are more trees, they live longer, they work better, etc., etc.
And I wonder, on this first one, are there any startups working on this project? Because it feels like very low technology. You know what I mean? Like planting trees or managing forests. Like, is that a concern for startups?
Yes, there are quite some startups in that space actually, because and we briefly talked about it before, but the MRV part is a critical factor here, and it's quite tech based. So, for example, there's Pina Earth in Munich. They have sensors. They measure exactly the tree growth and how healthy forests are, and they give advice to forest owners to say you can do this and this and this to improve your forests, and that will help to grow your trees. Because traditionally, forest management, you would go into your forest every 10 years and you take a measurement and you go around the tree and you measure how big the tree is or whatever. And frankly, I'm not the expert on forestry because we invest in the more tech-based solutions, but there are companies out there that use, satellite imagery and other measurement devices to do this MRV measuring, reporting, verification parts for forestry.
Okay, so talking about this topic of MRV, is it possible for a company to do those three activities together? Like, does it even make sense, or is there a conflict between these three activities?
There definitely is a conflict, and quite often companies say, "Oh, we're an MRV company," and frankly, I don't really like the term so much. I mean, I find the term MRV fine, but then if you're an investor, you would always want to ask one level deeper and say, "What actually are you doing?" Because MRV is an entire ecosystem. There are companies doing the measuring. They measure how much CO2 has been, reduced or removed in our case. And then there are companies that are doing the reporting. Sometimes you do it together, but quite often it's also separate. They're doing the reporting, the tracking. And then there are companies that are coming in and say, okay, and I verify that this has been happening. So basically they're taking the data that has been reported to them and they say, yes, I can verify there is 1 ton removed. And the verification happens based on standard setters. They are also part of this MRV ecosystem that say, this is how you need to remove 1 ton with this specific method. And that's the process that you need to follow. Those are the things that you need to do. And then basically at the end, if the independent verifier says, yes, you have done that correctly, this has been happening, I can, guarantee, then you can issue 1 ton of carbon removal, like a certificate for 1 ton of carbon removal onto a registry. And then somebody can buy it and say, okay, I've bought this ton of removal, like this certificate that guarantees 1 ton of removal.
That makes a lot of sense. And what's interesting about it is that I can see how that can add up to the price of a carbon credit. Like, you have so many different actors.
Actually, the price of MRV is interesting, and it still is like a price that is considerable and that needs to be added, but over time it will come down. And what companies are doing is that they separately, report how much the MRV costs are. And there are different costs, right? There's maybe a cost for somebody who helps you to report it. For example, Carbonfuture, a company, like actually the leading MRV company, they charge the suppliers for the reporting. So they collect the data, and according to the standard that the supplier is using, they gather the data and then they put it, like, deliver it to the verifier, and then the verifier says, yeah, okay, thank you, perfect, that's a certificate. So you have to pay for that, and then you have to pay for the registry. So different costs appearing in the MRV space.
That makes sense. So let's continue on the other technologies that are available then.
So that was on the very nature-based side. And maybe I should say this, but the idea is that you need something that captures the carbon. And in the first example that I mentioned, the afforestation, reforestation, it's the forest. It grows, it captures the carbon. And then in biochar, that's the next one that I'd like to explain. You have biomass, so everything that grows captures carbon as it grows. In the photosynthesis, we've all learned that in biology, you capture the carbon, it captures the carbon, then it's locked there. If it would die, if a tree dies, it releases the carbon again. So you want to avoid that. So you take biomass, and you heat up the biomass massively. You don't burn it, but basically what you get out is biochar. That's this brown thing. We all know it from using it on for barbecuing, like on roasting roasting veggies or whatnot. But basically, if you don't put it on the barbecue, if you just have this biochar, it's above 90% is just charcoal, like the black thing. It has the carbon locked into it, and if you can use that on soils, and it gets used again in the kind of like you can use it in the soil, you can use it for metal production, or when you build new roads, you can use it as a raw material and you put it in there, and then it's permanently locked either in the soil or in the products that you use it for. So that's biochar. I'm using pyrolysis. Then another one that's quite common is enhanced rock weathering. And the idea here is that you have silicate rocks, for example, olivine, basalt, or limestone. And the surface of the rock, when it reacts with water and CO2, it binds the CO2 and it creates a bicarbonate. And this is something that happens naturally all the time. So all the time when it rains, the rocks, they would store some CO2. And so basically enhanced rock weathering is you create more surface, and you do that by grinding the rock very small. Um, and so now you have more surface, so more surface can react. And you take this rock powder and you spread it on fields. And so when it rains, this rock powder, it reacts. It's a natural chemical reaction, and it forms a stable form of a carbonate mineral, a bicarbonate. And then this is transported in the soil underground, and it's washed into the water. It's dissolved in the water, and it's transported to streams and like rivers and the ocean, etc. And this sounds a bit weird, but this is naturally happening all the time. And basically, what you do is you just enhance it. You make it faster and more of it. And there's nothing bad about it. The critical issue here is the MRV part, the measuring part. Can you really measure how much carbon has been dissolved into bicarbonates?
You're mentioning MRV as a very important process because you have to make it a business. Because like if you were to only think about the planet and whether or not it's working, well, really you would just do that process and then you would assume that by default anyway it's removing carbon or how much you don't really know, but you would just do that. But because we are in the context of startups, you have to make money and you have to somehow prove that what you're doing is working, and therefore the MRV process is coming, right? Is that my understanding? Is it correct?
Absolutely. And I've said that before, that traditional carbon markets often had issues with additionality, etc. And the carbon removal markets, they rely on this measurability part, because if you cannot measure and report and verify credibly that you have 1 ton removed, then you would get in trouble over a long time, because you basically would do harm, right? If you don't actually remove a ton, then you're kind of like doing exactly the opposite. Somebody is removing a ton somewhere else, and you say you remove, but you actually don't do that. So this whole MRV part is critical to scale the industry to a gigaton.
What is the last technology that you were about to mention?
The last one, and I think the one that the whole carbon removal industry is very known for, and frankly, many people confuse carbon removal with direct air capture. Yeah, and that's the method that I wanted to introduce, is direct air capture. So that is the machines and the fancy Climeworks and Heirlooms out there. So basically, you can think of it as or sometimes it looks like a fan, or like a big, I don't know, toaster or whatnot. People have different words for it. Or some people refer to it as a vacuum cleaner. So basically, you have a machine that sucks air in. There's a solvent. There are two versions, or like various versions of it, but one, for example, the Climeworks, a company from Zurich, uses. We are invested there. They have a solid sorbent material in the middle. CO2 is captured in this material, and clean air, or CO2-free air just comes out of the other side. And then you use heat to dissolve the CO2 from this material, and then you have pure CO2, and you can store that underground in geological formations, and it will just mineralize there, and then it's again basically where it came from. And this is the fancy direct air capture, the very, very tech-based approach to carbon removal. And probably the most not known company out there is Climeworks. Another one in the US is Heirloom. They combine mineralization and direct air capture.
Very interesting. So if I just summarize what we've been talking about so far, so we basically have a market where people can sell carbon credits. That's not to be confused with carbon removal. It's just a market where if you remove CO2 from the atmosphere, we will pay you. Then on the other side, we have startups that are trying to build technologies from very low tech, so like planting trees, to very high tech, like direct air capture. That really is about how do we remove carbon from the atmosphere. And then we have another actor, which are the verifiers, which are the MRV of this world, so measure, report, and verify, which really those are enablers for startup to say, hey, like I removed some carbon, now get me my money. That's kind of the logic of what we've said so far. But on this podcast, we talk not only about climate tech, but also venture capital. And what I want to understand now is from a business model perspective, if you take direct air capture or even the solution that you mentioned before, the enhanced rock weathering, I'm wondering, like, are we only selling carbon credit? Is that the model? Like, are we only relying on regulation to make revenue? Or is there something else that I'm not seeing there?
Yeah, you ask a very good question. And I think that's also one where investors have different opinions. So at the core, most of the carbon removal companies, or basically the core of the industry, is really the carbon removal credit. And just to have an idea, there's like one carbon removal credit. The average last year was, I think, 444, if I remember that correctly. A good website, highly recommend, is cdr.fyi. They track everything, anything and everything about transactions and purchases on the carbon removal in the carbon removal industry. And so they do the analysis. And so I think it's 444 per ton of carbon removal credit. And so basically the whole industry wants to earn with this credit. So there are the carbon removal supplier, the companies that we just talked about, and then there are the buyers on the other side, and then there are intermediaries in the middle, like MRV companies, and there are platforms that transact the carbon removal, there are insurance companies, etc., more and more evolving. But yes, as you said, like talking about the suppliers, most of them depend on the sale of the carbon removal credit. However, there are some that have co-revenue streams. We talked about biochar before. So, for example, biochar companies, they have three revenue, or like most of them have three revenue streams. They sell the carbon removal credit. They can sell the biochar, like the brown charcoal that comes out at the end, and they have excess heat that they can sell as distant heat. So they do have other revenue streams, but still, most of the time they are, depending where they are in the world, but most of the time they are dependent on the carbon removal credit. Direct air capture is the extreme. They only have carbon removal credits. They rely on the sale of carbon removal credits. Enhanced rock weathering, usually there too, it's only carbon removal credits. And then, yeah, I think for afforestation, reforestation, sometimes there's a case for biodiversity, but frankly, that's not really the companies that we invest in. But there are cases where they have co-revenue streams.
So I'll cut you there just for a minute, because that means that we have an entire industry of startups that are all building toward the same thing, which is being able to deliver carbon credit as a product. But you said something just before. You said we have the buyers. I am not buying carbon credits. You're probably not as well. Like, who's buying carbon credit, right?
So typically there are two sets of buyers. There are governmental buyers and then there's the private sector. And so governments that have made commitments to get to net zero, they understand that they need a certain type of removals to reach their net zero goals. And there are a couple of jurisdictions around the world, a couple of governments or countries that started investing in carbon removal, but they're just starting. There's just a little bit happening. And then on the private sector side, we have 466 unique buyers right now out there, and there are 463 unique suppliers for durable carbon removal. And so from these 466 buyers, the majority is Microsoft and other tech companies, but Microsoft really is the biggest one. And so the entire industry is fighting for purchases from Microsoft. And so basically the main buyers, the top 10%, is Microsoft, other tech companies like Meta and Google, as well as the financial industry. JP Morgan bought a lot, Morgan Stanley is active in the space. And so, yeah, they make up the most. But then long term, of course, you need those players to come in that have the residual emissions, those that we cannot emit. We haven't addressed it at the beginning, but quite often, and I understand that people have this question, but quite often people say carbon removal is just a means to keep doing what we're doing, to not reduce emissions, but just, remove them because we're lazy and we don't want to reduce them. No, that is definitely not the case. And it's important to say that we have to put a lot of effort in using every means that we have to reduce emissions as much as we can first, and then we have some remaining emissions left that we need to remove, right? And those remaining emissions, they are coming from so-called hard to abate emissions, and those are from sectors that they inevitably cannot get to net zero. That is, for example, production of concrete and steel and plastics. There will always be emissions, or that we will always need fossil-based processes that we cannot get rid of, right? And so for those instances, we need carbon removal. And that's roughly 7 to 10 gigatons, or 7 to 9, if you want to be precise, what the latest research says, by 2050. So roughly by 2050, we need 7 to 9 gigatons of permanent carbon removal per year to get to net zero. Roughly, that's the idea.
I love that you're mentioning the word permanent, because what you're saying there, or what you're implying, is that there is a duration of carbon removal credits, or at least of carbon removal as a concept. And I kind of see it as, if you put water in a bottle, like how long until all the water gets evaporated type of thing. But can you help me understand, what is a typical duration for carbon credit? And is there really big differences between what do startups sell in terms of duration?
So there's no common opinion on what means durable. Is it 1,000 year? Is it 100 year? There are different opinions out there, and different standards have different opinions. I think the IPCC, the International Panel for Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change, the one that actually mentioned carbon removal for the first time and really kickstarted the industry. The IPCC, I think they say permanent is 1,000 years or longer. And many, I think, agree with that, but there are other opinions out there. But yeah, I mean, permanent theoretically means permanent. Durable means for a very, very long time. And as you just mentioned, there are different permanences in the different methods. I think where most agree is that when you mineralize CO2 from direct air capture or from other streams, and you mineralize it underground, then that tends to be permanent. That's perceived as permanent. But then, for example, biochar, there's debates about how permanent is biochar, using biochar in soils, etc., etc. Also, there's a question around products. If you use CO2 in cement, how durable and how permanent is it really? Is it going to be there forever, etc., etc.? So, still not really clear.
That makes a lot of sense. But I'm giving just a number out there, but when you say very long period of time, we're talking about 1,000 years, if not tens of thousands of years. So that's what we mean when we talk about like long duration in the carbon removal industry. But going back to startups, so I'm trying to think, tomorrow I want to build a startup in the carbon removal industry. Like, it feels like the biggest challenge I'm going to face is scalability and affordability. Because I'm like, if I'm going to remove 1 ton, it's probably going to be super expensive. But if I remove then maybe, and then I build a factory or whatever, and then I remove 10,000 tons, and maybe the price is going to go down. Like what is a challenge that these companies are facing when you look at them and you support them with the fund?
It really depends from method to method because they're so inherently different. So what you just mentioned, like this scalability and cost, that is a typical problem, and I think where many investors also look at critically for direct air capture, because basically you're inventing something completely new, direct air capture that hasn't been around for that long, and you're building these massive machines. It's really like it's engineering. It's a new, novel, deep tech technology. It's hardware, and all the problems and all the challenges that from hardware industries, you definitely find them in direct air capture. So, and you perfectly mentioned that building the first of a kind blend or test facilities that can maybe capture a couple of 100 tons or a couple of 1,000 tons, and that is already a lot. Um, Basically, at that scale, the costs per ton are much higher than most buyers would be comfortable of paying, and so they really work towards this 1 megaton or a couple of 100,000 ton facilities. But that's a long shot, and that will come 2030 towards 40-ish. And companies that are working towards, or like the furthest at once, are again Climeworks, Heirloom, others out there. But still, most of them are really at the very early stages, just starting to develop the prototypes, etc., etc. And so their challenge is reducing costs, bringing costs down, using less energy. Energy is a super critical notion in this whole equation, because that's where most of the costs are coming from, or quite often. And so investors will look critically at that.
Yeah, and energy source as well is very important, I suppose,
That's true.
because you don't want to do that if your energy is like full of CO2, then the equation doesn't work as well. But coming back to what you were saying about the market, so I'll pick your brain on a question that's maybe a bit outside of your comfort zone, but it feels like buyers on one side will probably be more and more like in the future, the market is going to grow. And it feels like the reason for me, at least, is that the global investors, so when I say global investors, like investors in like public market, are looking more and more for companies that are sustainable. And therefore, if you cannot change everything in your processes and you have residual CO2 emission, you're forced to actually buy carbon removal credits, right? um, is that the case? Like, is that the way you see the market growing in the future? Like, because I'm wondering, like, why do we even buy carbon credits, right? Like, I know it sounds like a stupid question, but I just wanted to pick your brain on that.
No, I mean, that's a super relevant question. Many companies face the challenge that there will be some emissions that they cannot reduce. And or the tech companies, they have a tremendous amount of emissions from their AI practices and like all their scaling up AI, etc., etc. And so they know that there will be some emissions that they cannot reduce. So they will have to buy carbon removal credits at some point. And that's why tech companies are already doing it now, because they know that this is coming towards them, and they want to show, hey, we're leaders in this space. We're doing that already now. And they want to understand the market and learn what carbon removal is all about. Yeah, right now there's a lack of buyers. There's a lack of new buyers. I feel like a lot of companies are on the waiting line. They're looking into the space. They know they need to buy because they know they cannot otherwise not get to net zero. But they're the market is still like a black box to them, or they are not comfortable investing yet. They don't understand it well enough. It's too expensive, etc., etc. And so basically they're observing, but they will buy at some point. And one factor that I also want to mention is, and that's also that goes into our investment hypothesis, is that besides the voluntary carbon market that we talked about a lot, there's also compliance market. Currently, the EU, but also other compliance markets around the globe, are considering discussing how to include carbon removals into these compliance markets. And as soon as that's going to happen, and by 2026, the EU has to present their proposal, how it's going to happen for the EU. By that point, there will be much more clarity, and then much more companies will act and actually buy removals because they know that they have to at some point. And then there will be much more clarity on what is 1 ton, how do I compare all the methods, what's the standard, what is, et cetera, et cetera. So the moment that we have carbon removal in compliance markets, and we believe that that's going to come, that's also the moment where basically the whole industry is maturing and leveling up.
Makes sense. So if I summarize, we basically have a couple of things happening here. So we have financial investors looking at companies, big companies right now, like technology companies, but other companies as well, to be greener companies, because that's going to be a criteria for success in the future. We have also the compliance market that you were mentioning, that if you don't comply, it's going to cost you money, and therefore you better be compliant, otherwise it's a risk on your business. And then we probably have something else that I'm going to add to the equation, which is more and more people, talent, and employees care about climate change, care about sustainability, and they will choose companies on whether or not it's a sustainable company to join. And therefore, for companies, it's also a strategy to acquire great talents and employees. So I think that makes a good mix for companies to become greener, and for some of them it means reducing their emission, and all of them will have to. But for some of them, there is a residual part, as you said, which they have to remove, and that's through the carbon removal market. So that's a bit of my summary of what's happening so far in this market. But if we go back to your role as an investor, that's more talking about you specifically, but what do you see the role of venture capital in accelerating the development of those technologies? And do you think venture capital is even the fund and the type of vehicle that are supposed to finance carbon removal technologies? Because they're quite capital intensive.
Absolutely. I do think that right now venture capital plays a critical role, because most of the companies, they are still in early phases. They have a list of risk. There are technology risk, there are market risk, policy risk, legal risk, or et cetera, and all the typical VC risks, basically. So yeah, I do think that at this point, venture capital funds play a critical role, because at the stage where these companies are, and frankly, there's a framework that I've used for my master thesis, actually, at ETH a couple of years back, or two and a half years back. There's this framework of when do investors, or which type of investor invests into deep tech, hardware deep tech technologies along their growth scale. And often, or there's this idea of, or this framework of technological readiness level. And that starts from really the concept to a fully commercial technology. And many of these carbon removal technologies are somewhere between 4 and, let's say, 4 and 6. And that is the point where venture capitalists are the ideal type of investor, because risks are still high and you have this growth scale, growth phase. And so VC is the right type of money because it's too early for banks and growth investors to come in. And so, yes, I do believe that VCs right now are a critical source for scaling carbon removal technologies. And as you said, there are a couple of business models that are not suitable for for investors or for VC investors. They will find, or they have to find different types of money, governmental investments, maybe philanthropic investments, more infrastructure type of funds. But there are tremendous, several business models that are suitable for venture capital right now. But there's a point and that's coming soon. Where, as you said, we're moving into like scaling, where the where many of these technologies are very capital intensive, and then we need other types of funding that need to come in quickly. And it's a challenge. It's definitely a challenge for the carbon removal industry. Who's going to come in after the VCs? But I'm going to stop it there.
That makes sense. And, as you said, there are probably going to be like infrastructure funds or like bigger funds that have more capital to deploy to, help bridge the gap between what VCs are doing right now, financing early stage innovation that, doesn't really have a proven model yet. And the stage at which there's going to be like large scale deployment of technologies, which is probably going to cost tremendous amount of monies. Going back to you, you've invested with the fund in probably like 15 startups, if I remember correctly. What are the things you look for into startup? What's your like go-to list of like 5-10 questions you want to answer in order to make an investment in a carbon removal company?
Yeah, it's actually 15 companies that we have in our portfolio. And those are like early stage pre-seed to Series A where we do invest globally. And I mean, we invest in anything that's durable, permanent carbon removal on the technology side. And then we also invest in the what we call carbon market infrastructure. So anything that's needed to scale this, future multi-billion-dollar industry. So marketplaces, we look into insurance topics, we look into financing topics. When we look at the technology side, as I mentioned, the measurability, the MRV part is super critical for us, and the durability permanence, because we believe that those are two factors that allow credits to be sold into compliance market, and that's where the story ties together, right? So we believe that that we're currently in a pre-compliance market, but in the long term, the compliance market will be the markets where carbon removals will be sold. Like the most of them, there will still be a VCM, but we do like anything that's compliance ready or like suitable for compliance markets. So I think those are the key factors that we look at. And then Max, the partner who started the fund, he also puts a like super high emphasis on technological innovation. So and really like the fundamental we really like to invest into the fundamental technologies that build this industry. So it's something that is new, that is patent provable, that is really innovative and new and hasn't been there before. That's something that we like and where we put our money and have put our money in the past. On the tech side, and then on the software side, various business models like that are where we think they are relevant to scale the market to gigatons.
That makes a lot of sense. We're getting towards the end of this episode, but I have 3 fire questions for you, and you'll have to answer in 1 or 2 sentences. My first question would be, you've met with many entrepreneurs, many companies in the CDR space. What is one advice? If you could only give one advice to an entrepreneur trying to build in the space, what would that be?
I guess if I were to pick one, it would be to leverage the momentum that the carbon removal industry has to partner up and join like industry initiatives, because there's so many happening right now. Like there's so many initiatives, groups forming around biochar and around enhanced rock weathering, and partnering up with like-minded pioneers will help you get ahead faster, and you can learn from them and help each other. And I think that that's something nice, that's like something beautiful happening in the carbon removal industry right now. And so I would advise every startup to, not just to try to do it alone, but like find like-minded founders, other pioneers, get together with them and try to like be smarter and faster together.
Great, that makes sense. If tomorrow I'm joining a VC firm as an analyst looking to invest in CDR space, what are the three things that I should look at during due diligence to make sure that this is a good investment?
You should definitely look for permanence. I mean, that's one of the factors that we look at. Is it a permanent carbon removal? And like, is it provable? So that's the second thing. I think, is it measurable? Can you measure that 1 ton has been removed, like credibly? And I guess the last thing, is it solid technology? Like, most of the technologies are coming straight from university, but there are more like that are trying to get into the space, think they have something, developed something new, but like, is it really solid, provable technological innovation that has the potential to remove a gigaton?
Great. And my last question for you today is what milestone should I watch for in the industry over the next 5-10 years? And you cannot say the compliance markets taking on.
I was about to say that, I guess. So I do think that there will be innovative or like innovative technologies in direct airspace where you can capture CO2 with light. I'm very particularly excited about that, and that might come out onto the market, like out from lab. I know that there's something brewing at ETH, which I'm excited about. And then I think generally, it's not the integration into compliance market, but like the change in carbon markets. I think 2025 will be crucial for that because there's so much happening on the political side. There's so much more political emphasis, support for carbon markets happening around the globe. So I think that is something that will dramatically change over the next 5 to 10 years for sure. That's a tailwind for carbon removal. And so I think that's the second one.
That's great. So we're getting at the end of this episode, and I'll do a quick summary of what I've learned today. And you'll tell me if I missed some stuff. But basically, if I want to look at the carbon removal industry, there are a couple of factors that I need to look at. I need to look at the different markets in which you can sell carbon credits to understand how to sell the product that startups are producing. I need to look at startups, obviously, that have from very low tech to very high technology products. I need to look at the buyers, which are often tech companies, but could also be any companies. And we hope that all of them will buy carbon removal or at least have some sort of carbon reduction in the future. We need to look at policies and regulator to understand how that's going to impact the market. And I'm thinking that I've got everything, right?
That was a perfect summary.
Lovely. So, Lisa, where can we find you online? What's the best way to reach out?
LinkedIn always works. I'm usually quite responsible or responsive, so LinkedIn is a great way to reach me.
Great. Well, thank you so much for today. This was VCO2, the first episode of VCO2, the podcast that helps you become a better impact investor and climate tech entrepreneur. I'm Hugo Roche, the founder of this media company and a finance manager currently at Microsoft. And I hope you learned something today. Thank you so much.